Daggett. He'll be with us to talk about the economic impact of deploying U.S. troops in the Persian Gulf. We'll open our phone lines for your calls on the troop deployment and its effect on the federal budget.
Stephen Daggett, a national defense analyst for the Congressional Research Service with an emphasis in studying the budget of the military. Given the budget deficit, can America afford the cost of its Persian Gulf military buildup?
Sure. The Pentagon estimate is that it'll cost about $1.2 billion over the next 2 months, which out of a $5 trillion economy we can certainly afford. I mean, we can certainly afford this more than the Iraqis can afford the constraints on their economy that we're imposing now.
Well, explain how we can afford anything if every year we're talking about budget deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars.
Well, I think it certainly is going to impose some changes in the defense budget over the short term. Congress may well be asked to appropriate some additional money just over the next 2 months, and it will certainly affect the debate over the 1991 federal budget to some extent. But what that means is we may very well end up putting off deficit reduction to some extent. We'll reduce the deficit in fiscal 1991 not by $50 billion, say, but by $30 billion or so.
Our phone lines are open. We'll go to the phones in a few more minutes as we once again begin our daily discussions of different aspects of what's happening in the Persian Gulf. Stephen Daggett of CRS, Congressional Research Service, is with us. You can use the phone numbers that appear on the bottom of your screen, area code 202-628-2525 if you're calling from the Eastern or the Central Time Zone. Mountain or Pacific Time Zone residents, 202-783-2727. And if you're calling from outside the United States, dial area code 202-737-6734, making sure to dial the appropriate country code first. Welcome, Stephen Daggett.
Glad to be with you.
Quickly, what does it mean to be a national defense analyst for the Congressional Research Service?
Well, the Congressional Research Service is part of the Library of Congress. Our job is to provide information to members of Congress on an unbiased, nonpartisan basis. And my job is keeping track of what the debate over the military budget is and looking at the military budget in the context of the debate over the federal budget deficit and also looking at longer-term defense budget needs.
So you are not an employee of the Pentagon?
No, not at all. I work for the Congress.
All right. Now, one of the estimates that I have in front of me came from the Department of Defense. It's dated last
August 15th, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And they say that it's costing, on a daily basis, I think it was $21 million a day?
Yeah, roughly $1.2 billion over the next 2 months through September 30th.
Okay, divide it by 60.
Divide by 60, right.
All right. How accurate, in your judgment, is such an estimate?
I mean, the Pentagon is certainly in a far better position than anybody else to make a good estimate of what the costs will be. And, I mean, it's not a simple task for somebody sitting outside to figure it out. I've tried to sit down and figure out how much the cost per flying hour for a C-5A, for example, is, but then you multiply it all out and you don't know what you have. So it really does take the Pentagon sitting down and going over the numbers pretty closely to have any real sense of what the costs will be.
Does that mean then that only the Pentagon is the source of accurate numbers?
Well, in the end, yeah. I mean, we're just going to have to look to them to figure out what the additional costs will be over and above the normal day-to-day operating costs that everybody else knows a lot about.
How is the Graham-Rudman cuts are expected to become effective, I guess, October 1, aren't they?
Right.
All right. So we're heading steadily toward that. So what does that mean in terms of the military budget?
Well, it's a real consideration. I think it does two things. One is it creates a great deal of pressure on Congress and on the administration to come to some kind of agreement on the budget that will avoid these automatic cuts taking effect. And I mean, this whole crisis also has an effect on the negotiations over the budget settlement in another sense, and that is that because of the negative consequences for the economy, it seems less likely that the negotiators, the administration and Congress, will want to take $50 billion out of the economy by reducing the 1991 deficit by that amount. So they'll come back to town on September 10th and sit down and try to figure out a different deal, which probably will involve a little bit less of a cut in the deficit.
Now, all of this started happening when Congress was out of town.
Right.
Yet you're here. What kind of inquiries are you getting from members of Congress about the finances of this exercise?
Well, we're getting the same kind of questions that you're asking. People in Congress want to know how much is this going to cost. The other question is there likely to be a supplemental appropriation as soon as they come back for fiscal year 1990? And I think the answer to that is I'd be surprised if there weren't. This is quite an additional cost to impose on top of the Pentagon budget at the end of the fiscal year.
Now, you've talked about, and I guess the DOD, Department of Defense, has talked about, what, a 60-day cost?
Yeah, that's all they've projected so far.
Nobody's projected further.
Well, some people have come up with some estimates of what the daily cost will be over time. I mean, I think it's not unreasonable to project your $21 million a day cost out over the next several months.
Out indefinitely.
Almost indefinitely.
Are there cost savings on a, I guess, longer term volume rate if we stay longer than if we...
Not significant ones. I mean, a large part of the initial costs presumably are costs of transporting troops and so on over there. But I wouldn't expect the transportation cost to go down substantially simply because the logistics that you need to sustain a force of this size in the Persian Gulf will be very high. So I wouldn't expect the cost to go down dramatically at all.
Okay. I want to get your reaction to a few of the estimates that appeared in the New York Times earlier this week. In fact, it was Sunday. And I think we can show up on the screen and have our audience take a look at it. The first list of those costs, you should see it shortly. Here it is, the cost of deployment for the Navy. Now, we've got 1.7 million for the Independence, 0.7 million for the for Eisenhower, and so forth. As you look at those from where you sit, do they look like realistic numbers to you?
Well, those are the $1.7 million a day cost of the carrier battle group is the normal operating cost for an aircraft carrier battle group in everyday activities. I would say that it's not quite technically correct to say that the deployment in the Persian Gulf will cost that much for each of those groups because some of them would have been there anyway. Normally we maintain 1 or 2 aircraft carriers in the region, one in the Eastern Mediterranean and one swinging into the Indian Ocean occasionally. And we will probably now maintain not one or two, but 3 or 4, so you can add some cost there.
And it's important to point out in this chart, is all of the later ones that we'll see during the rest of this segment, they're daily costs.
Those are daily costs,
so
right.
It's 1.7 million for the Independence Carrier Group, but you suggest it might be a little bit less.
Well, you shouldn't count all of the costs of all of the carrier battle groups every day as being an additional cost to this. I mean,
all right, let's go to the phone. Stephen Daggett is our guest. He's from CRS, Congressional Research Service. And our discussion subject this segment is the costs of the military buildup in the Persian Gulf. Schenectady, New York, you're on the air.
This is Vienna, Virginia.
Well, we'll take Vienna, Virginia.
Okay, I have a question as regards what percentage of oil is Japan getting from Iraq and Kuwait, and how much of the cost are they offsetting? I'll hang up and listen.
Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I'm not an expert on the oil market, so I really don't know how much oil Japan is getting from Iraq or from the Persian Gulf in general. Also, it's not clear yet to what extent our allies will offset the cost to the United States of the deployment in the Persian Gulf. It appears that some of the allies, especially Saudi Arabia, is putting in a considerable amount of money. They're providing water and fuel for U.S. forces there right now. And some of the other allies, including especially Japan and also Germany, will be asked to provide some support in coming months.
You know that?
I would be very surprised if they weren't going to be asked.
Because that's kind of a political question, isn't it? And we'll get to that in a minute. But in the meantime, we do have Schenectady waiting patiently. Go ahead, please.
Yes, a question of our deployment of troops and particularly the infantry divisions to near the populated places in Saudi Arabia. And this is not a question of cost, but suppose the crisis is and there's a standoff, and this goes on for months.
Right.
Two-part question. One is the morale of our own people in what seemed to be a hostile environment, and the other, the impact on the relationship between Saudi Arabia people who have a completely different culture than what our own troops would be used to. Do you see any difficulties in if this goes on over the long term?
Well, again, I have to say I'm not an expert in
Well, let
these
me
kinds of
reiterate that we've
deployments.
got Mr. Daggett here, and I remind all of our potential callers, talk about the money side of it, where the money's coming from, how it's being expended, if there's any to continue. And I don't think you want to talk about whether we're doing the right thing or anything like that.
If I can avoid it, I'd like to. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll,
Because you're not speaking for the CRS on any matters other than the numbers.
My area of expertise is
Okay.
pretty much the budget, the numbers.
So given that, do you have a response to him at all?
Well, I mean, I think there will be some, if this deployment is sustained over a long period of time, obviously there may be some problems in sustaining the presence in a lot of ways, sustaining morale, sustaining relations with the Allies, and also sustaining the economic costs of it. At the same time, right now, there appears to be a lot of support for this deployment here in the United States, in the Congress, and certainly from the Saudis.
All right, Houston, Texas. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. How are you today?
Fine, thank you.
Okay, a couple of questions. How much is Kuwait paying toward the troop buildup? I understand that you gave a figure of X amount of dollars. Is this the whole amount of money in a 2-month period that is going to cost the American people to deploy troops over there, or is this just part of what the whole spectrum of the cost is going to be, including what Kuwait would be paying? And secondly, if in fact we have a $5 trillion gross national product here, why can't we pay off the federal and trade deficit?
All right, thank you, sir. Houston, Texas.
Well, as far as I know, Kuwait is not directly contributing funds at this point. Again, down the road, they and some of the other countries we're supporting in the region may be expected to contribute something to this. The $1.2 trillion is the Pentagon's estimate of the incremental or additional cost to the military of deploying forces in and around the Arabian Peninsula through September 30th. So it's not the total cost of the deployment, because we expect certainly that it will continue beyond that. And it doesn't include some other potential costs as well. It doesn't include, for example, the cost to the Pentagon or to the cost of the country as a whole of increases in oil prices.
Just so we can provide more of a context, let's show another slide of some of the daily military costs provided by the New York Times in its last Sunday newspaper. These are the costs of deployment for the Marine Corps, the Army, and the Reserve Guard forces. Those numbers, what do you have to say about those numbers?
That's harder for me to interpret. On the Reserve and Guard forces, it says 50,000 troops. My calculation is generally that we're now in the process of mobilizing about 50,000 troops from the reserves, and just the additional pay cost of that will be about $75 million a month, so about $2 million a day or so. Not quite $4.2 million.
Okay.
But, you know, those are in the ballpark. When you add up the figures for the Navy and Marine Corps and Army figures, you come up with about, I guess, $30 million a day, which is somewhat more than the Pentagon had suggested. It also seems to be underestimating the costs on the Army side of the ledger. The Pentagon said that out of the $1.2 billion in costs that they estimate, about $750 million is a cost to the Army. And primarily that would be costs associated with the Army financing transportation through the Military Airlift Command. They pay the Air Force for the cost of transporting troops and so on.
And I should mention that the New York Times itself credits these numbers with the Center for Defense Information, an organization of retired senior officers. And it does not take into account subsequent developments since the numbers were provided, such as the call-up of reserves.
Right.
Next call for Stephen Daggett from the Congressional Research Service is from Killeen, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Sir, my question to you is this. How come we have so much money and spend so much money when something like this comes, but seems that we never have the money to spend in national interests such as schools, education, and maybe medics and so on. But when it comes something like this, appears to me by what I see and I hear and I feel that the money is there.
All right, sir. Thank you. Killeen, Texas.
Well, that's a question members of Congress have certainly been asking on a pretty regular basis for the past several years. The best answer I can give to that is that, at least in the past few years, both the defense budget and non-defense spending have pretty much been in the same boat, that both have been declining in large part because of pressures created by the huge federal budget deficit that we have. And I have to say that nobody really expects that the crisis in the Persian Gulf will reverse the long-term downward trend in defense spending. Now that our relations with the Soviet Union is improving and the Warsaw Pact has collapsed, it appears that the military budget is on a downslope, and this may mean that the slope will not be quite as steep, but nobody suspects that Pentagon spending is going to be increasing in the future.
You mentioned, or some of the callers mentioned, about other nations contributing to our military activities there. Senator Dale Bumpers from Arkansas has written a letter to the President dated August 23rd, according to the press release here, urging him to ask for other nations to help share in the financial costs of the U.S. presence in the Middle East. Mechanically, do you know, I don't know if you can answer this, but how does that work? Do we get a check from Great Britain?
Sure.
I mean, is that how it works? And where does it go?
Yeah, I would, sure, it's an offsetting receipt to the budget. It's a receipt to the budget, just like tax revenues or anything else. It would go right into the Treasury.
The general fund?
General fund.
And then the U.S. Treasury would allocate it to the Pentagon. Okay.
Well, not necessarily directly to the Pentagon. Again, money for the Pentagon has to be appropriated specifically for the Pentagon. So the money would come into the Treasury, and it could be used to offset the deficit or whatever. If we,
or to build an interstate highway, or to...
Or indirectly.
Or
but all funds in the federal budget are fungible, as they say in the budget business. You can do one for one purpose or another.
Could Great Britain insist that we don't give you our check, so to speak, unless it's dedicated to this specific purpose?
Sure, they could say, unless we see that you've appropriated X amount of additional money to the Pentagon over and above what was expected.
They'll stop payment.
Yeah, but...
or whatever.
And there certainly will be some costs that we can identify specifically for this deployment. That's not going to be a problem. It's just an accounting matter.
Okay. Oklahoma City, you're next. Go ahead, please.
What did the President recommend for pay raises for the active and retired military for the next year's budget?
The President has recommended 3.5% pay raise for the military as well as for non-military personnel in general.
So
as a federal employee, I pay a lot of attention to that as well.
Across the board recommendation?
Across the board.
No distinction between military and non-military?
Not this time, no. Sometimes there is, but not in this case.
What did the pay board recommend to the President?
4.2% was the initial recommendation for a pay raise.
And he came up with 3.5.
Right.
And what did the board observe was the gap between private sector and public sector salaries for equivalent jobs?
I can't speak for the whole federal budget. I know within the military the gap now is about 11 to 12%.
We've got half an hour to go as we continue to take your calls about the financing side of the Persian Gulf activities by the United States. Stephen Daggett is an analyst in national defense issues, particularly the military budget, with the Congressional Research Service. And the next call for him is from Palos Verdes, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Do you expect the American people to believe that you're over there for that much money for one little Kuwait that is a king? What's a king to us? And not for the oil? To spill American boys' blood for oil? Why don't you
well,
be
caller, do you believe that anybody's saying that it's for any reason other than oil?
I think that the people, some of the American people think that we are really going there to do a job, to help the kings and queens over there.
All right.
Wait.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Daggett?
Well, the President has laid out pretty clearly, I think, what the general interests that we have in the Persian Gulf area are, and they include both oil and preventing the fruits of aggression from being seized.
Louisville, Kentucky is next. Go ahead.
The cost of operating the military here at home, if we wasn't over there in Saudi Arabia, wouldn't that have to be subtracted from the expense that they're putting out right now over there to have the correct figure of what it's costing over there?
No, this estimate of cost is an estimate of the cost over and above the normal operating costs. I mean, so for example, in estimating what the cost will be, we're not including military pay because people would have to be paid anyway, and some of the aircraft carriers would already always be there in any event. So you try to separate out those costs and just talk about what the additional costs will be. And the additional costs are pretty high. I mean, that includes a lot of transportation costs, a much higher tempo of operation. And normally aircraft fly about an hour a day, about 30 hours a month. Well, we're going to be flying them at least 3 hours a day just for normal, just to safeguard the air bases they're flying from and so on. So these are the additional costs over and above normal expenses.
Anything else, caller? All right, thank you. Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm a military member, and I was just calling to make a comment concerning our raise. I would rather for you to go ahead and keep that 4% raise that's coming up next year, because it's ridiculous. First of all, I know a lot of guys, know myself, and other guys on these bases around the country are barely making it. And that 4% is just an insult. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Well, I'm supposed to be a disinterested observer here, but I'm subject to the same limitations on pay raises as well. So maybe I shouldn't comment. I will make one comment, though, and that is that the entire federal government is under a lot of fiscal pressure because of the federal budget deficit. And I think the constraints on the pay raise and constraints on other things are a function of that. And this crisis certainly is not going to make those pressures any less significant.
And by the way, it's not 4%, it's 3.5%.
3.5%.
Join us later this evening at 6:30 p.m. East Coast time. Senator Dale Bumpers from Arkansas will be here to take your calls to talk about the events in the Persian Gulf, and you'll have an opportunity to ask him about his call to the President that other nations join in sharing the expense of the military activities there. Honolulu, Hawaii is next. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to thank you guys for great coverage of all different things that we don't get in the top 40 news, like I call it, CNN and whatever.
Thank you.
I'd like to also say I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I'm really interested in kind of solving things peacefully. But it appears to me that the some white male Americans who are on top and have been on top are making it really hard for people here in America to be successful. I mean, this is, from what I hear in C-SPAN, a lot of the problems that we have here in America. And now we're going off and send our boys, like I was in Vietnam, to kill and maim and destroy our boys and people and other kids from other parts of the world for their benefit.
Caller, do you have any comment about the cost of this? That's what Stephen Daggett is going to be able to respond to.
Well, basically my comment is just that I think that the cost is not even, to me, it's not even money. It's the lives of these people that are over there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Honolulu, Hawaii. Well, I think we've got another slide that summarizes the cost of these activities. And this, again, is from the Center for Defense Information, is published in the New York Times. $31.9 million is the estimated daily cost of deployment. And as I mentioned, we got a press release, the Pentagon says $23 million. Is that enough? Is that reasonable? That difference?
Sure. I mean, everybody at this point is trying to do their own kind of rough, quick calculation of what the cost will be. The Pentagon itself says that this is a preliminary estimate. And I should emphasize one thing. This estimate does not include the cost of the recent reserve call-up, which I put at about $75 million per month. So, we're trying to get a handle on the costs. I'd say the DoD is in a better position to estimate the cost than anybody else at this point, but the CDI effort was a good first cut at it.
All right. CDI meaning the Center for Defense Information. Next call for Stephen Daggett from CRS, which means Congressional Research Service. Wildwood, Illinois. Go ahead.
I have a question. If we've finally established this final total amount, who's going to ultimately pay it? Our children?
Well, you and I are, perhaps in higher taxes, and ultimately what this will do is it means that we'll be borrowing more money next year than we otherwise would have. Yeah, we're going to pay it, and you and I are going to pay it in higher interest costs, and our children may pay it to the extent that it adds to the federal debt.
On the screen is a listing of the expenses, daily expenses for care and feeding of the troops. This information comes from the Defense Personnel Support Center. Are you familiar with that entity?
I know who they are, yeah.
And there we have it, sunscreen, 150,000 bottles. Is this bought at retail and off the, you know, where do they get this?
They make a contract with people who bid on the contracts and presumably get it from the lowest bidder.
Well, sugar repellent, $76,400. Well, that can't be a daily cost. That's got to be a one-time
Total
cost.
cost so far.
It's hard to tell.
I hope so.
Murfreesboro, Tennessee is next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes. I would like to know what is the real cost to the economy since most of this money is being spent in the United States. Thank you.
Well, again, the real cost to the economy is $1.2 billion or so over the next, well, through September 30th.
So whether it's spent there or here is irrelevant.
Yeah, in an economic sense in the long term. It is the same burden on taxpayers, and it takes the same amount of resources out of the civilian sector that could otherwise be used for something else.
As you look at where the money is spent, and this might be relevant to the caller's question, which sectors of the economy are likely to benefit most from this buildup?
Well, again, it's not a big buildup. It's we're talking now $1.2 billion out of a $5 trillion economy. It's not going to show up in the third decimal point of the economy. It's an interesting question to speculate on how this will affect defense industry, for example. And I suspect that what this will affect is mainly the kind of arguments that are used over the trend in the defense budget, and may have some effect in slowing the rate of decline in defense spending, but ultimately isn't going to have a huge effect even in the defense budget. And some parts of the defense budget might be favored by this more than others. But in the end, won't be that big a difference.
And you're looking now at the cost of deployment for the Air Force. And we'll continue with the calls for Stephen Daggett. This from Fremont, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my question is for Mr. Daggett. And what would be the cost of the United States and its people if we had not deployed and put a stop to Saddam Hussein and his takeover of the entire Persian Gulf?
Sure.
I think that is a question that most Americans haven't even asked themselves.
All right. Thank you.
Well, we're getting, again, I'm not an expert in that, but we're getting one indication of some of the costs that have already been imposed by this crisis in the increase in oil prices. Oil prices have increased from about $18 a barrel before the crisis up to $31 a barrel, and I guess they're down now to about $26 a barrel. By the way, just for the Pentagon, this increases their own costs. The Pentagon itself obviously uses a lot of gasoline and oil and jet fuel and so on. Every dollar, the estimate is that for every dollar per barrel increase in the price of oil, it costs the Pentagon about $200 million a year.
And I should mention, too, in light of that comment, that the numbers we've seen from the Center for Defense Information were all based on an estimated cost of oil of $31 a barrel.
Right.
So the numbers will fluctuate in that sense, too.
Yeah, and the Pentagon numbers that we talked about do not assume an increase in the cost of oil prices.
Farmington Hills, Michigan. You're on the air.
Yes, the evacuation of Israel from occupied territories in Palestine, Golan Heights, Lebanon, would be the most effective, efficient of means of lowering the deficit, let alone increasing it.
Anything else?
$1.2 billion is a lot of money, and if peace can be attained with Hussein, that by virtue of agreeing to release those territories in Palestine by Israel, would be something worth considering.
All right, sir, thank you. And I suppose if we never went there, it would also be a zero extra cost.
Well, to the Pentagon, at
yeah,
least,
by way
sure.
of saying that that's really a political question.
Mm-hmm.
That,
sure, how you settle this cost is a political question.
That's right, and you're hired to look at the numbers and give that guidance to Congress so they can make those decisions. Asheville, North Carolina, go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. I'm calling with just two facts and one question. Essentially, perhaps you may or may not be aware of it, 1 penny per gallon of gasoline at the pump in the United States is worth $1 billion a day. That's how much gasoline we use. Now, any refinery can take a barrel of crude oil, and if it's any good, can give you between 60 and 65% capability of turning this crude oil into gasoline. Now, how can you justify, or they justify, adding 10 and 15 cents per gallon for a 10-day period?
All right, sir, thank you.
I assume you're going to have an expert on the oil industry in pretty soon.
Well, if we haven't already, and I know we have, then we'll have some later on. I have to, by way of protecting Mr. Daggett from these political questions, to remind you all that he's here to talk about the extent of the costs, how they're arrived at, and how the numbers are useful to Congress, which I should ask you about. These numbers, how do you present your findings to the Congress? Is it through a particular committee or individual members? How does that work?
Well, we will respond in any way a member of Congress wants us to respond. We provide reports that on a regular that we update on a regular basis on trends in the defense budget and trends in defense authorization and so on. We have a report that we update regularly on the deployments to the Persian Gulf and their costs, and then we'll respond on the phone or in letters or whatever.
Houston, Texas is next. We've got less than a quarter hour to go with Stephen Daggett of the Congressional Research Service. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, I would like to really know where is this money coming from? We keep hearing that Kuwait is going to put money in. We hear that Saudi is going to put money in. We hear that Japan is going to put money into this. I am much more concerned about our American soldiers in Saudi Arabia. I would like to see these boys with their faces on the air, and I'm talking about the Emir, I'm talking about Japan, I'm talking about Saudi. Let's see them, as we have seen, in fact, Saddam Hussein, who is supposed to be a devil, but we supported him in previous years. Let's see these people on the air discussing exactly what it is that we are doing for Saudi, what we're doing for these oil countries, and I want to know who is going to pay this bill. We keep hearing these rumors, and yet it isn't happening.
Thank you.
Well, again, Saudi Arabia is putting in a certain amount of money up front. They're paying for some of the fuel costs and for some of the water costs and so on, and maintaining forces there. And I suspect that over time some of the allies will be requested to provide some additional funds for this. Some of the other allies, Britain and France, for example, have sent limited amounts of military force to the area themselves.
Stephen Daggett, I want to get your reaction to a AP Wire story that was just handed me by our producer, because it's particularly relevant to our discussion. And see what you think. The Defense Department has nearly doubled the estimated cost of the Desert Shield deployment of U.S. forces, putting it at $2.5 billion. The sharply increased costs, up from an earlier estimate of $1.3 billion, can be attributed to the expense of calling up Reserve and National Guard forces, operations for ships, aircraft, and increased fuel costs. Other factors include increases in the number of C-130 aircraft, the number of aircraft carrier battle groups deployed there. The cost estimate includes $1.13 billion for the Army, $494 million for the Navy, $556 million for defense agencies, and $300 million to account for the increased fuel prices.
Right. Well, it shows what I had to say. It's why people like myself kind of shy away from doing estimates early on, and maybe the people in the comptroller's office at the DOD would have preferred to shy away from it too. They were under the gun to come up with some estimate, and they did. Again, as I said, the numbers are not surprising. It's not surprising that they're increasing, and one reason for the increase would be simply the cost of the call-up of the reserves, and now they are taking account of the increase in oil prices, whereas they didn't previously.
So all of the charts we just showed you are irrelevant.
Well, out of date.
Out of date. Relevant at the time, out of date now. Memphis, Tennessee, go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon. I've got a money question for you.
Great.
Good.
The $1.2 billion we keep hearing about is...
It's now $2.5 billion, by the way.
But it's still being referred to as a deployment cost through September 30th.
Right.
Is there a hidden question there that costs would go up if the situation erupted into a shooting war?
Oh, sure.
And could you quantify that somehow?
Good question.
Oh, absolutely. These cost estimates all assume that this continues to be a military standoff, that we don't get into hostilities. And if we do get into hostilities, some people have compared it to the situation in the event of a war in Europe, for example. Larry Corbin, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the early Reagan administration, said earlier that we estimated the cost of a shooting war in Europe at $2 to $3 billion a day back in 1985, and he thought that this would be not as intense, but $1 billion a day estimate might not be an unrealistic one. Obviously, in that situation, cost would not be the main consideration. The cost in blood would be much more significant than the cost in treasure, as they say.
It can get a little morbid after a while, I should think.
Sure.
For example, the cost of a poison gas war would be different from, I guess poison gas is not a conventional weapon, so.
Well, it's a different kind of weapon, and I don't know, apparently we would retaliate with, not necessarily with chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. We would still use conventional forces to retaliate.
After this call, I want to ask you about why you got into this business in the first place. Columbus, Ohio is next. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like your comment on my point that if we wouldn't have worried about the cost when Adolf Hitler went into Austria, World War II would have been less costly, especially if the entire world would have joined up like we are now against Adolf Hitler earlier in his escapade through other nations. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, the fact that it's expensive does not necessarily mean we shouldn't do it.
And I'm not so sure cost was the overriding factor in 1939, 1940, 41.
Not at all.
Let me ask you, as I look through your resume, you've been associated with defense information in one way or another almost since you graduated from school. Did this area seek you out, or did you go after it?
It's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it. There's a saying in Washington that anybody can analyze the cost of a budget, won't be looking for jobs too long.
So why military, and why not, I don't know, something like environment or something else?
I mean, those are areas of interest. I was interested in the Vietnam War when I was in school, and interested in arms control and strategic weapons issues for some time after I got out of it, and it just evolved into an expertise on the defense budget.
Clovis, New Mexico. Go ahead, please.
I was in during the Cuban crisis in the Army, and I think that Bush is following through, just like Kennedy did, by a show of force, and I think people should quit worrying about the cost. We put money out into other countries. Why shouldn't we back our own country right now? I think if Bush follows through, we will have a good standing, and we'll get back the, I don't know how to say it, but the face that we lost during Vietnam because we did not follow through. I think if we do the job and let Bush do what he wants and forget about the cost and go for it, I think we'll be a lot better off.
Thank you.
Well, the popular support for the president is running pretty high right now, in spite of information on the cost of the involvement, in spite of the fact that our estimates of the cost appear to be increasing at this point. But some people have raised the question, how long will the public continue to support this kind of involvement there? Probably not primarily because of the dollar cost, but just because of the burden on the military personnel that we're sending to the region and so on.
How many scenarios do you have going at any one time in terms of coming up with a budget number? For example, you've got one for cessation of the deployment in 90 days, one for hot war, one for an extended deployment. How many?
Well, we're just trying to catch up with what the initial cost will be for right now. Obviously, your cost, the cost of it depends upon what the situation is over time. If it looks as if we're now going to send about 100,000 troops to the region. We've talked about contingencies that call for sending as many as 200,000 troops to the region. And then if there's a real conflict, if there are hostilities of some kind, all of these cost estimates will appear relatively insignificant.
Dover, Delaware. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to know if in your cost, have you added into it that the added pay cost to the military personnel, and if the reservist is in for over 6 months, the added military benefit cost that it will
Yeah, the initial Pentagon estimate of costs assumed that people in the region would be receiving what's called imminent danger pay, which is about $110 a month, and also after the first 30 days of deployment would get family separation pay, which amounts to about $60 a month. So those costs are calculated in, even though imminent danger pay has not yet formally been declared by the Pentagon. On the cost of reservists, again, initially those weren't counted. Now that they are counted, it's pushing up the cost of the deployment considerably. Reservists, when activated, are paid at the same rate as active duty forces and receive the same benefits.
I will reveal my ignorance on this issue, but in terms of longer-term benefits, such as retirement and that sort of thing, because you're on active duty in a combat zone, does that increase the payout that the United States is obligated to later on?
No, that's a given per per person,
so the fact
per
that there was
period
a hot
of
shooting war
contribution
doesn't increase the annuities? And
not at this point, not under existing law.
Okay. San Diego, California, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Well, I want to ask the gentleman, the congressman, about
You've just promoted him, by the way. He's not a member of the Congress. He is, I guess, an advisor to the Congress.
Yes, one of those.
Okay. Okay, my question is, why is the whole world, the Western world, stopped against Iraq about his invasion of Kuwait?
Caller, once again, Mr. Daggett is here to talk about the dollar cost, and he's not prepared to answer any policy question. Do you have any question about how much this thing is costing the United States or the world?
No, I just want to ask him about how long it's going to take that.
Okay. Do you want to answer that one?
I have no idea how long it's going to take. I'm not sure anybody else does.
Not even the politicians?
No, not the politicians.
Altoona, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir.
Yes, sir. The gentleman just shortly a while ago mentioned that Saudi Arabia has paid something. Now let's take a look at the record. Our troops went there as defense forces to defend the Saudi royal family and their oil. Why don't we stop being the big suckers of the world and make these people pay for their protection? We are protecting the Saudi royal family. It's a defensive, and I agree with that part. Because down the road, sir, the people who are now saying, forget about the cost, wait till this winter and see what our energy costs are going to be in this country and what Congress is going to cut out of senior citizens' benefits down the road.
All right, sir, thank you. I might point out to you and others that Senator Dale Bumpers is concerned about that very same issue, and he'll be here at 6:30 p.m. East Coast time, 3:30 in the West, to take your calls. He has called upon the President to seek contributions from our allies for defraying this cost, and perhaps if you tune in then, you might even get in to ask him a question about that. Senator Dale Bumpers at 6:30 p.m. East Coast time. Do you have any comment?
Well, you know, the issue of how we share burdens with the allies is always a very intense political issue, and I might relate what the Defense Department at least always says about how we share those burdens, and generally what they say is that the cost of forces that we deploy overseas are the costs of defending U.S. interests as well as the interests of allies. So, I mean, we're certainly protecting our own interests as well as the interests of others. But again, I suspect that over time there will be some effort to get some economic contributions from allies.
And I should mention also that other members of the Congress, as they make their way to Washington, will be on. And stay tuned to find out the exact times for their appearances. But later on will be Congressman Ronald Matchley, a Republican of Florida, Congressman Christopher Smith, a Republican of New Jersey, and Congressman G.V. Sonny Montgomery, a Democrat of Mississippi, and he'll have something to say about military appropriations, I would think. Sure. Hyattsville, Maryland is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Actually, I have two questions. One is the Kuwaitis said they were going to pick up part of the tab. I'd like to know how much, or did they make an offer, monetarily wise, how much? And two is, will we reinstate the windfall profits tax? Can we tax the oil companies for this 10 cents a gallon or whatever it is and use that as a defense tax?
All right. Anything else?
That's That's about it.
Thank you, sir.
My answer to both questions is I don't really know. I don't know how much the Kuwaitis have talked about contributing or if there's been any figure discussed at all. On the question of a windfall profits tax, when Congress comes back on September 10th, there will be discussions about how to get the federal budget deficit for fiscal year 1991 down, and part of that discussion will concern possible sources of additional revenue. The conflict in the Persian Gulf has perhaps eliminated one source of revenues that was being talked about, and that was some kind of oil import fee or other tax on gasoline. The problem with that now is it would further increase the price of gas when it's already going up. So it's more difficult to find revenues from that source. And there may be a search for some additional alternative sources of revenue.
El Paso, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening. I have a couple questions for you, I guess. My question is, how much are we paying for a gallon of gas?
You mean how much is the U.S. military paying?
For instance, my gas costs me $1.42 per gallon. So how much are we paying for a gallon of gas?
I mean, I'm not sure exactly how much the Pentagon pays. It's affected by an increase in oil prices just as everybody else is. As I said, every $1 increase in the cost of a barrel of oil increases costs the Pentagon by about $200 million a year. So they're hurt by this as well.
But we can't tell you an exact per gallon cost, caller.
The old toilet seat cost.
Do you have another question?
No, that's it. Thank you much.
All right, thank you. I guess by making mention of the toilet seat, he's wondering if maybe they're paying $3 a gallon or something like that.
I suspect they're not. I suspect, matter of fact, they get bulk rates.
Okay. Columbus, Ohio. Go ahead. Columbus, Ohio? You're on the air.
Oh, I'm Columbus, Nebraska.
Well, we'll take it.
Okay. My opinion is that we don't stop paying for war until the last veteran has died, because these programs for the vets go on and on and on and on until their death. And I believe we're probably still paying for World War I. We haven't finished paying for World War II, or the Korean War, or the Vietnam War, and now we're adding this war. And I would like to see an honest printout of what all these 4 or 5 wars are costing us each year.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, I recall it wasn't too long ago that the last dependent of the Civil War veterans died, and you know, something in the 60s, maybe the 70s. So it's not, the cost doesn't end with the death of the veteran.
Not necessarily. Cost of veterans benefits, if I'm not mistaken, this year will be about $40 billion in all. So you can certainly say that that's a cost of prior wars from World War I or the Spanish-American War through the war in Vietnam.
And to the extent that there are injuries and disabled veterans, those costs go up.
Right.
So do you think that you're going to be placed in the position of answering some congressman's question about what the 40-year cost of this engagement will be?
I hope not right away, at least.
But it could happen.
Sure.
Santa Rosa, California. You're on the air.
My question is, how much of a difference between what they're spending for the deployment and what they would have spent on salaries and stuff anyway? In other words, you know, if they would have, they're paying the troops anyway and they're paying to maintain the ships, et cetera.
Right. No, again, as I should have emphasized maybe more at the start, is the estimates of cost, now about $2.5 billion, I gather, through September 30th, is an estimate of the incremental cost over and above the normal day-to-day operating expenses of the U.S. deployment to the Persian Gulf. So that includes things like the costs of additional costs of transporting troops, additional costs of spare parts and use of fuel because of the higher tempo of operations and so on. It doesn't include the normal day-to-day operating expenses and military pay.
So if it's $500,000 a day just to operate and do nothing more than operate, then the figure that we were using of $31 million a day wouldn't include that $500,000.
Right, precisely.
All right. Charleston, South Carolina is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I'd like to ask you a question. It's regarding basically taking into account the price of oil, the oil prices that's going up right now, and the hold the Japanese have on the U.S. economy. What could be the worst possible scenario if you were to analyze it?
Well, I mean, the worst possible scenario would be a shooting war, and one hopes that that doesn't happen.
Have you played out these scenarios in your staff?
No, we really have not systematically tried to figure out what the costs of a war would be. We've looked at costs of other contingencies, such as the escorting Kuwaiti tankers in 1987, which was about $20 million a month. The cost of the Panama invasion, which the Defense Department recently estimated was a total of $163 million. All of these kinds of contingencies pale in comparison to the costs of this deployment. This is really a very large, very rapid deployment of U.S. forces.
You said that CRS is an independent agency vis-a-vis, say, the Pentagon, or some of the branches of the Pentagon. What do you do when there's a vast difference between estimates?
We'll tell people what the different estimates are and try to analyze why there are these differences. And sometimes we'll do venture some estimates of costs of our own. I mean, we're occasionally tasked to do things like that, and we'll do anything we reasonably can.
Tyler, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. You're on the air.
Well, what I wanted to say, I think about a week ago, I heard a retired General Odom, and I think he was in Carter's cabinet, I'm not sure, and I think he said something about that an army of occupation might be in Saudi Arabia for 20 years. Is that sort of an estimate?
Well, General Odom, if it's the same General Odom, was the head of the National Security Agency until recently, and is a very well-regarded analyst. I would say the projection that we'll have an army presence in Saudi Arabia for the next 20 years is his own opinion, and certainly does not reflect the official estimate of the administration. Although Secretary Cheney, when asked, had said he was not clear when this involvement would end.
By the way, in terms of what the official estimate is, during this program we have an AP report that says that the Department of Defense now has nearly doubled its estimated cost of the Desert Shield deployment, putting it now at $2.5 billion. It was at 1.3 when we started the program. And it factors in the new expenses of calling up the reserve and so forth. We continue with our guest, Stephen Daggett of the Congressional Research Service. Next call for him, Las Vegas, Nevada. Go ahead, please.
I just have a couple of questions. You all have been commenting and using the word contribution, what the other countries should be paying. Shouldn't you use some word like what is due us? And the second thing is, what additional cost has there been because Bush has been on vacation? Lights up there, staff. And I also heard, I just heard this, that the reason that he stayed on vacation was he had a non-refundable deposit on the room. Thank you.
For some reason, the word 10-foot pole comes to mind as you try to answer that question.
Yeah, I think I'll try to stay away from what the increased costs of staying in Kennebunkport are. Given the weather here today, I'm sure I can understand the President's reasons for staying there. On the question of contributions from allies, what you call it, I mean, you can make whatever editorial comment you want, I suppose, on that.
Stephen Daggett, we're out of time. Thank you very much. National Defense Analyst for the Congressional Research Service. We appreciate your time today.
Great. Glad to be here.
We'll continue the discussion on events surrounding our activities in the Persian Gulf, this time with Nicholas Kittrey, a professor of law at the American University, and Mayor Nudell, a senior associate for international affairs at the Corporate Response Group. They're here to talk about the legal status of the hostages, or at least those Westerners who cannot get out of Kuwait in Iraq. We'll be back in just a few minutes with them.
Good afternoon from Washington. You're watching C-SPAN, and we'll take a break now for some programming information. First, a reminder to join us tomorrow morning on C-SPAN when we'll bring you live coverage of an argument in a federal appellate court. The U.S. Court of Military Appeals will hear arguments on the constitutionality of the military's death penalty. Again, that's Wednesday morning, beginning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 6:30 on the West Coast. Coming up in just a moment, we'll continue our discussion of events in the Persian Gulf as we're joined by law professor Nicholas Kittrey of American University and a senior associate for international affairs at the Corporate Response Group, Mayor Nudell. Both men will join us to talk about the Western hostages being held in Iraq and Kuwait. Just after that, we'll hear from a number of members of Congress about the situation in the Gulf. At that time, we'll be joined in our studios by Democrat Charles Bennett of Florida, Republican Ronald Makeley of Rhode Island, Republican Christopher Smith of New Jersey, and Democratic Senator Alan Dixon of Illinois. We'll continue our discussion of events in the Persian Gulf at 6:30 Eastern Time. At that time, our guest is Democratic Senator Dale Bumpers of Arkansas. He'll be with us this evening to take your questions and comments on events in the Gulf, the U.S. energy policy, and dependence on foreign oil. And finally, join us at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll hear from the Bolivian ambassador to the U.S., Jorge Crespo Velasco, who will take calls on the Bolivian initiative to fight drugs. He'll also talk about the U.S. relationship with his country. And that's a look at some of what's coming up here on C-SPAN. Thank you for watching.
Here are some recent letters from our C-SPAN viewers.
Isn't it rather late to have programs on the Middle East trying to get American understanding of a problem that we should have studied 50 years ago? Another viewer writes, why is background music seemingly obligatory when announcements are made or when historical fillers are used? Background silence would be relaxing and a welcome change. And finally, one viewer writes, C-SPAN has become no more than a mouthpiece for the conservative right. There is no more liberal press. Correct the balance.
We'd like to know what you think about our network. Write to us at the C-SPAN Networks, 400 North Capitol Street, Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001.
Up next, we'll continue our discussion of events in the Persian Gulf as we're joined by law professor Nicholas Kittrey of American University and a senior